Canada was never intended to be a global power, not in terms of military projection, and certainly not through aggressive economic dominance. For decades, it occupied a very specific role, stable, predictable, and quietly integrated into a global system led by other actors. But that logic is no longer holding, and almost no one is tracking it. It isn't happening loudly, and it isn't happening suddenly. It is occurring subtly, through infrastructure, geography, and the slow acquisition of systemic control. When you look closely at the underlying architecture of global trade, one question emerges. Is Canada becoming one of the most critical control points in the modern global economy? Most people still perceive Canada through a traditional lens, a peaceful nation, vast in resources, and inextricably aligned with the United States. It is rarely viewed as the place where the future of global power is decided. In the Arctic, for the vast majority of modern history, the Arctic was treated as a barrier, a frozen, impenetrable frontier that was too remote, too hostile, and too expensive to actually matter in the grand scheme of geopolitics. But that entire assumption was predicated on a single condition, that the ice would remain. That condition is failing. And when physical conditions change, the systems built upon them inevitably follow. What once served to isolate regions is beginning to connect them. What once acted as a friction point for trade is becoming a catalyst for speed. Canada sits directly at the center of this transition, not as an observer, but as a position of leverage. Geography is perhaps the most stable form of power. It doesn't fluctuate based on political sentiment or change with every election cycle. It simply exists, shaping every economic and strategic reality around it. For centuries, global trade has been forced through a very limited number of channels: the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and the Strait of Malacca. These are the primary arteries of our global economy. However, they share a common vulnerability. They are narrow, increasingly congested, and strategically exposed. The Arctic changes the fundamental geometry of this map. As the ice recedes, a new corridor becomes viable, the Northwest Passage. This is a route that connects the markets of Europe and Asia directly through the northern coastline of Canada. It is significantly shorter than traditional routes, less congested, and completely independent of the world's established maritime choke points. When distance collapses, the underlying cost structures of global trade change. When those costs change, trade patterns shift. And when trade patterns shift, power moves with them. Canada doesn't just sit on this route, it defines who can use it. Geography alone is just potential. A route only becomes an active system when it is supported by physical infrastructure, ports, runways, monitoring systems, and supply hubs. This is where the shift becomes tangible. Canada is currently investing heavily in its northern territories, though these projects rarely make international headlines. They are expanding airstrips to handle heavy cargo aircraft. They are developing deep water ports in maritime zones that were once entirely inaccessible. And they are deploying sophisticated surveillance and radar arrays across vast, empty distances. On the surface, these initiatives are framed as regional development, national security, or environmental adaptation. But through a systems analysis lens, they serve a much more profound function. They are converting geographic potential into operational capability. Infrastructure performs a very specific task. It makes temporary opportunities permanent. Once a port is built, ships will find a reason to use it. Once a runway is extended, logistical traffic will follow. Once monitoring systems are operational, control becomes enforceable. This isn't about Canada reacting to a changing climate. It's about deciding what becomes possible and building the framework to manage what comes next. Beneath the Arctic's surface lies another layer of systemic significance: resources. We are talking about critical minerals, energy reserves, and rare earth elements. In the modern economy, these are not optional assets. They are the essential inputs for everything from high-end electronics and renewable energy systems to the advanced hardware required for artificial intelligence. For years, the global supply chains for these materials have been heavily concentrated, most notably in China. This concentration creates a systemic dependency, and in geopolitics, dependency is the ultimate form of leverage. And leverage, over time, becomes control. Canada represents the primary alternative, not necessarily because it aims to be the largest producer, but because it acts as a stable, accessible, and politically aligned source of these critical inputs. This places Canada in a unique position as a bridge between systems. It isn't achieving this through traditional dominance, but through strategic placement. Just across this northern system sits Greenland. It is a territory often overlooked and rarely discussed in the context of global power, yet its strategic significance is immense. Greenland provides the necessary geographic reach, resource potential, and positioning between North America and Europe to complete the Northern Circuit. Importantly, Greenland is not a competitor to Canada in this system. It increases the reach of the system without changing its center. Together, they form a northern axis. This is where we see the traditional structures of power begin to pivot. The United States has long operated within a global system where key trade routes and strategic nodes were either directly controlled or heavily influenced by its own presence. The Arctic introduces a more distributed dynamic. Multiple routes, multiple actors, no single point of control. China recognizes this shift clearly. Their goal isn't ownership, it's participation in the system. Because in the modern era, control is defined by influence over flow. What we are witnessing is not a sudden explosion of power, but a gradual, deliberate reconfiguration. A shift driven by geography, enabled by infrastructure, and reinforced by resources. Canada is not becoming a traditional superpower. It is becoming something else, a control point, a platform, a node. The most important aspect of this shift is how it happens, quietly, consistently, over time. By the time the shift becomes visible, the system is already in place. Watch the shift.